like to talk. So we have been privileged to have Dr. Rosie Donne, who's a consultant nephrologist at Rochdale Hospital, who will be talking to us about addressing engagement, live donation, and early detection in the community.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation to speak today. And that's really quite a mouthful that I've claimed I'm going to speak about. So I hope you stay with me. A lot of what I've said, other people have touched on. So I work with a team of people at Salford Royal, including 2 nurses there. And my specialism in preparing people for kidney transplant and dialysis. Hopefully transplant, not dialysis, because as you've already heard, dialysis can be a difficult life. So my interest in South Asian healthcare actually began on my medical elective in 1993, which was quite a long time ago now. I went to the Lady Willingdon Hospital in Manali in North India for a period of about 3 months. I thought I knew a lot because I just passed my finals and how little I knew when I got there. But it was run by these 2 beautiful characters, Laji and Sheila, whose vision for their area where they had created this hospital was that in order to transform the communities and their healthcare, it could only really happen successfully when they came together and began to own their own health. And I think nothing could be more true today for what we've been talking about. So there I had a humbling experience of a lady who came into the hospital with kidney failure. And although we had blood tests and x-rays, it became clear that we could do really nothing useful to save her life. So she got packed into a taxi on a 250-mile journey to Chandigarh, where unfortunately she didn't survive. So it's a very stark message to me of how little could be done for her at that time in India, and I think that stayed with me ever since. And of course at the time I aimed to learn an Indian language and go back and change the world, and life got in the way. But here I am today. I've never been back to India, but I would love to go someday. So the overview of my talk is really a couple of patient stories, one of an unplanned start to dialysis, of what we don't want, and one of somebody whose son gave a kidney to her before she ever needed dialysis. I'll talk about why preemptive transplant is the gold standard of care, and focus on some kidney inequalities in the Black, Asian and minority ethnic population. We'll talk a little bit about the medical and cultural barriers to transplant, some of which you've already heard about. Talk about the ideal pathways of early CKD detection through to the best outcomes. How we can try to work together to improve engagement with our local communities. And I'm sure there are many people in the room who could help with that if we come together and work together. So my work with this really began last year, or maybe 2 years ago, when I met Khalid, who was a patient of mine. And he wrote an article for the Manchester Evening News last year for World Kidney Day. And I'll just quote a small section. "My legs started swelling up, and then one day I couldn't breathe. I was admitted to hospital and found that my kidneys were only working at 9%. It was a huge shock." And that was really his very sudden introduction to the world of kidney failure. And a shame that that was how it happened to him. He was previously very active, playing badminton, golf with friends every day, very well known in his local community, in the mosque in Rochdale, and he'd actually been interested in running a lot of health promotion programs in his local community. He'd been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes about 10 years earlier and already had established retinopathy and high blood pressure and was somewhat overweight. But he had never taken it seriously, and he was just thinking, it's only sugar, isn't it? How bad can this be? Just do what I like, eat what I like, I feel fine. And he knew a lot of friends and family who had the same attitude, really. So consequently, when I met him, his HbA1c was running very high at about 100 to 120. He had heavy proteinuria, more than 10 times the normal amount. And in December 2017, his GFR, his kidney function, was around 15, meaning his kidneys as a pair were working at 15% of normal. So I actually met him for the first time in April 2018, actually. He'd already had 2 admissions to his local hospital with fluid overload, feeling very unwell. In April I discussed with him about the need for a transplant and how the speed of the progression of his kidney problems meant that he was almost certainly going to need dialysis first. And although we started the transplant workup process, it really didn't happen quick enough for him, culminating in his admission 2 months later to Salford Royal with overwhelming fluid, which didn't respond to diuretics, and he ended up starting dialysis through a central line. And since then, he's been on dialysis 3 times a week, which has had a lot of ups and downs. Came through a very difficult time and is now feeling more on an even keel. He had a fistula in the arm, which took a little while to get going and is now very good, so he's now dialysing on that. And then in October 2018, he entered the transplant waiting list, and he's still waiting. He had a call up about 3 months ago. He was the reserve patient, so he didn't proceed with having the transplant. So the wait goes on. So, you know, he's a very educated man, and he's been thinking, what does life hold for me? What future do I have? He has grown-up children and lots of friends and family. And I'm sorry if there are people in the audience who are affected by kidney disease, because these facts that I'm about to tell you are really quite stark and hard-hitting. But I do think it's important that we all understand the nature of the problem. So at age 59, with diabetes, on dialysis, sadly his life expectancy is only around 5 or 6 years, which seems, you know, unbelievable because he is such a force of nature and such a lively character. We hear a lot, don't we, about the life expectancy of people with cancer, but it's not quite so well talked about how long people may live with dialysis. And you'll see on this slide, at the bottom is the life expectancy of lung cancer and pancreatic cancer, which we all know is very poor. And the next line up is actually the life expectancy with dialysis, which is worse than if you have colorectal cancer or breast or prostate cancer. But we don't hear about it, do we, in the news? We don't have campaigns on the media about that. So what that amounts to is about a 30% chance of surviving 10 years on dialysis. This is not at the age of 59, this is for anybody on dialysis. So why do people die on dialysis? So we know that they have a 10 to 20-fold increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So they may have sudden death from myocardial infarct, or develop unstable angina, or they may have a stroke. Sudden death on dialysis patients may also be attributed to high potassium. It can be very difficult to know in hindsight why someone has perhaps passed away in their sleep. A lot of people suffer with infections, which may be the ordinary infections that anyone might get, like pneumonia, but it may also be complications of dialysis lines or peritoneal dialysis catheters, resulting in overwhelming sepsis. And these things can happen very suddenly. So for that reason, we really want to avoid dialysis, both in terms of quality of life and length of life. So the best form of treatment for most people when they reach CKD stage 5, so a GFR of 15, is that they would have what's called a pre-emptive transplant. And that means a transplant before dialysis is ever needed. And ideally, this would be from a living donor. This offers the best life expectancy, best quality of life, and the kidney would tend to start working much sooner, so you wouldn't have that 1 or 2 week delay that it would have described to us. It would often be working from day one, and so the benefits in terms of quality of life happen very soon. So really we should be aiming for a preemptive transplant in all of our patients who are well enough to have a transplant. And we know that this offers an extra 5 to 25 years of life expectancy. It can be a wide range, and the reason for that is it depends on what age you are when you have that transplant, but also what other health problems you may have to contend with. But even a 75-year-old who's well enough to have a transplant may gain an additional 5 years on top of what they would have if they were on dialysis. And given that the life expectancy in this country is about 81, you know, if you have a transplant at the age of 75, your life expectancy may approach the normal life expectancy. But if you go onto dialysis at that age, you may be lucky to live 3 years. If you're much younger, you may get perhaps an additional 25 years of life expectancy on top of what dialysis may offer you. And we've already heard that a kidney itself, a transplant kidney, can be working well for in excess of 20 years. I think the oldest I've heard of is 50 so far in the UK. But we know that for many of our patients, although they may go on the list when the GFR is 15, which would be brilliant, many of them it's a lot later. We know that the wait time on average is about 2.5 years. And we also know that many of our patients lose their kidney function at a rate of at least 10 mils per minute per year. So if you're going onto the list with a GFR of 15, in a year your GFR is going to be 5. And within that time you'll have needed to start dialysis. And you'll probably still be waiting for another 1 to 2, maybe 3 years. So this is why we've all got to get everything sorted out so that people have this big enough window of opportunity to have a preemptive transplant. So how are we doing in the UK with this challenge? So on average, if you took 100 people who reach end-stage renal failure and need either a transplant or dialysis, 9 of those will have a transplant first, and the other 91 will go on to dialysis, and all the suffering that brings. However, we know already that we can do better than that, because Belfast in Northern Ireland, a few years ago, they started a project to improve their transplant chances. And within just a 3-year period, if you took 100 people who reach end-stage renal failure in Belfast, 28 of those would be able to have a transplant first and never meet dialysis, and only 72 would start dialysis. So we know it can be done by coordinated efforts. Now clearly the Belfast population is quite different. I don't think there are many Muslims in Belfast. People have large families, they have lots of children, lots of cousins, so there are possibly a larger pool of possible living donors. But in the South Asian community, there are big families as well. So I think that there's a huge benefit that can be had if we work together. So what is happening in the South Asian population? So there aren't data on preemptive transplant in South Asians as such, so I can't give you those facts, I'm afraid. But we know that from this Kidney Health Inequalities report, of which there are some copies on your tables, which is a very useful report, which doesn't just focus on South Asians, but inequalities of all different kinds. We know that people from ethnic minorities are much more likely to have CKD. Clearly there are many reasons for chronic kidney disease, but in the South Asian population we know there are increased risk factors of type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity and cardiovascular disease. And we know that people from this community are 3 to 5 times more likely to start dialysis during their life than the white ethnic population. We know that they're less likely to choose home dialysis. Generally, we think home dialysis tends to be associated with better outcomes in terms of quality of life and length of life. We know, sadly, they are much less likely to have a living kidney donor at the moment, and they're less likely to receive a kidney transplant. And on average, once they reach the deceased donor waiting list, they will wait about an extra 250 days. And that can feel like a very long time when you're on dialysis. I think we've already heard from Angela that about 35% of people waiting for a transplant in the UK are from ethnic minorities. But we know from looking at the organ donor register, people who've signed up to be donors, that only about 7% of those are from ethnic minorities. Now, you don't have to have a transplant from someone from your ethnic group, but you're just more likely to find a donor if there is a wider pool of people who are willing to donate from a wide ethnic mix. So there are some medical barriers as well, which I come across time and again. People often progress towards dialysis very rapidly, so we have a very short window of opportunity in which to work them up for transplant and help them through the process of both psychological acceptance and physical preparation. And there's often not a lot of time for them to talk to friends and family about living donation. Obesity is quite a significant barrier sometimes. Imagine trying to lose weight and exercise when you're feeling really tired all the time. But sometimes if the BMI is very high, this can prove a barrier and the patient needs to try to lose weight first. But again, this can be less of a barrier if you have a living donor and you can have a planned transplant because the risks are lower. We know that for some patients they have quite a heavy burden of cardiovascular disease, which may mean they're never actually stable enough to have a kidney transplant. Some patients I meet have quite intractable foot ulceration. We can't really do a transplant if someone's at risk of sepsis because of big problems with foot ulcers or foot ischemia. and sometimes they just never reach a point of being well enough. I think language barriers can play a part, because sometimes people aren't able to read the letters or the text they get to inform them of tests, so they may miss things and the workup is delayed. And it certainly helps if people have a buddy or a family member who speaks good English to help them navigate the system. We've already heard about the shortage of living and deceased donors. And some people do have large family abroad, maybe in Pakistan, but it can be quite difficult for those potential foreign donors to be cleared from the home office to reach the UK. So it is possible, and it has happened, but it takes a long time. So the longer we have, the better. So with Khalid and his family, we did explore over sort of long discussions about the various cultural barriers to living donor transplant, looking at the recipient and their family and friends' perspective. We know that it is a fact that a lot of the potential donors out there may themselves be at risk of CKD and diabetes, and this may rule them out from the very beginning. I think what came through was a lot of worries about the risks to the donor, both from the recipient worrying about it and also the donor and their family. So a fear of surgical complications or time off work leading to loss of employment or financial hardship. And it's hard to argue with these things, isn't it, because they're very real issues. And then looking at the foreign donor pathway, which I haven't really thought about this, but worries that a family abroad, perhaps in India or Pakistan, may become financially dependent on the recipient if they have complications of donating a kidney. And they're obviously a long way away. And to know that you received an organ from somebody and their family is now struggling would be very hard. And this is not just in the South Asian population. This is I've talked to people in the black ethnic minorities as well. So there's clearly a lot to think about. And then we talked about the cultural barriers to engaging with more routine healthcare, so diabetes and CKD services. And Khalid felt that the most central problem really was a belief that perhaps diabetes isn't that serious and it may not really lead to any significant problems. And he said it, in his group of friends and family, people would just sort of keep eating what they wanted and just take extra metformin or extra insulin, and it wouldn't really matter, everything would be all right, which I was quite shocked when he said that. But clearly he wasn't the only one. There was a lack of awareness of the link between poor diet, being overweight, progression of diabetes, and then progression to kidney failure. There was definitely a fear of speaking to healthcare professionals, a fear of hospitals and treatments. And as we've said already, people are getting lots of views from friends and family and religious leaders in trying to help them navigate this very difficult business of decisions. He said one of the things, he's always been very proactive about getting involved with things, but he found that although health services had been often redesigned in his local area, he didn't feel as if people from his community had really been consulted as much as they could be in terms of how to redesign it to make it easy for them to engage with those services. And he felt there was a great opportunity for improvement with that, because some of these redesigned services didn't seem to really sort of gel with his group. And he'd been on the Desmond course for type 2 diabetes management and been on the training course to become a Desmond trainer. But halfway through that he just felt this wasn't for him. The way the course was running, it just didn't really work for him and his community. So he didn't really feel that was something he could do, which is a shame because I think he would have been brilliant. So we've started to understand a little bit, and I've probably only scratched the surface, and obviously I'm not from that community, but I'm just beginning to learn. So now onto a good news story. So a lady I met when she was in her 50s and had very rapidly progressive kidney failure due to diabetes. And her son always used to come with her to clinic. And she was always very, very fearful of everything that was going on, and it was all happening very quickly. So Naseeba's story. So her diabetes was diagnosed in 2007 when she was in Pakistan. By the time I met her, her kidney function was already down to 13%. I'm not quite sure how much healthcare she'd had in the lead up between 2007 when she was diagnosed with diabetes and 2012 when I met her. But we were already playing catch up with trying to get control of the situation. She wasn't particularly overweight, and her diabetes by the time I met her was actually well controlled, but she did have very heavy proteinuria, and this is one of the hallmarks of rapidly progressive kidney failure. So over a 7-month period, we tried to get everything ready for transplant, but we also had to talk about dialysis because we didn't know which one was going to happen first. And every time my son said he wanted to donate, and she was very against it. But he was very determined, and he went through the workup process, and just in the nick of time, when the kidney function was 7%, and she was feeling really quite ill, he donated to her, and she avoided dialysis, which was amazing. And her kidney function is now 70%, so she has a GFR of 70. She feels very well. She comes to the clinic every 3 months, and he's doing very well. He's finished his studies. He was a student at the time, and it was a brilliant story. I think he would be happy to tell that story more and perhaps help out with health promotion videos and things, and we do remain in contact with him. So the challenge is, how can we make Naseeba's story the norm so that we don't have hundreds of people on dialysis? And I think it can be done, but we all in this room need to be pulling in the same direction and saying the consistent messages to patients and their families and friends. So just a little bit on the kidney patient's journey, which you've already gleaned some from those 2 stories. So clearly in primary care, my colleagues here detect CKD at variable stages whenever it comes to light. So in CKD stage 3, the emphasis is on partly could this be improved, could it be reversed, but mainly how can we prevent progression. So diet, exercise, blood pressure control, medications, stopping smoking, lifestyle advice. And for many people that does work very well. But nonetheless, some patients will progress to CKD stage 4 with kidney function less than 30%. At that stage, that's when I tend to meet them and we begin discussing transplant and dialysis. But you'll have seen from those 2 patient stories I put up there that I didn't meet either of them until they had CKD stage 5, and it's less than 15%. And at that stage, we're really having to get our skates on to prepare for both things together, which is a very traumatic process for the patients. And our nurses, Lisa and Jenny there, are very intricately involved in that process. So we hope that kidney transplant will happen first, but if we're having to work quickly, often it doesn't. And people would need to start dialysis when the kidney function is somewhere between 6 and 8%. So thinking about how would we ideally do this, and the main thing is having a long enough period of time to control things and to talk about transplantation so that living donors can come forward, because it can take a while. So by the time that they get referred to me, we've already got some plans in place, so we're not starting from the bottom. And really what I would like to do is begin discussing living donation really in earnest when the kidney function hits around 25%, instead of the kind of less than 15, which it often is at the moment. Just thinking a little bit on diabetes, because there have been some advances in recent years, and I'm not a diabetes specialist, and I'm not sure there may be people who know more than me about that in this room. But I think there have been some exciting developments, and this is really crucial why we need to be doing better with early management and early detection. So there have been several new drugs in recent years, so these are a bit of a mouthful. SGLT2 inhibitors, for example, canagliflozin, I think one of the NAP Pharma was there this morning. And I'll talk about that trial in a minute. And then we've got GLP-1 agonists, so exenatide, liraglutide, a few others. But both of these are in the very early stages of CKD. So way before I ever meet people, they can have these drugs. But you have to detect the kidney disease and the diabetes early in order to get the benefit. And many of these drugs are not licensed once the GFR drops below 60 or 45. So we have to get in there early or we won't have the benefits. And I think a lot of South Asian patients are probably missing out on this window of opportunity because they don't even know they've got diabetes or kidney failure. So we can't really get in there with those. There's been some interest in the last couple of years about diabetes reversal with very low calorie diets, which I think are milkshake type diets. And I think this is soon to be approved by the NHS, or already has been. I think that's imminent. But how will these work in different ethnic groups that may or may not like having a diet of 3 milkshakes a day. So it might be that it might work in clinical trials, but will it work in the real world in our ethnic communities of different types with our busy lives and jobs? And I think there's a real opportunity for better team working between primary, secondary and tertiary care with virtual clinics for joint care. So a nephrologist wouldn't necessarily need to see a patient with CKD3, but perhaps just talk through their case and whether they would benefit from any of these newer treatments. And I think there's real opportunity there. So just to focus on the Credence trial, which is on canagliflozin, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine towards the end of last year. So this was looking at giving the drug to people with type 2 diabetes and early nephropathy. And just the headlines really, a very encouraging trial which showed a 30% reduction in end-stage kidney disease or death or cardiovascular endpoints, and a slowing of renal decline by nearly 3% per year. And what this may mean in practice is that instead of having a gap of 6 months to get a transplant, if you've known about this for ages and your CKD can be slowed down, such that you learn about it, you find a living donor, you've got this much longer time window to think about whether you can have a transplant and actually have it by the time. I mean, this drug would need to be stopped way in advance, but it's just lengthening that window of opportunity to optimally manage the patient. And it's important because one criticism of clinical trials in the past has been that they focused on white patients, mainly in the trials, but in this trial, 20% of the patients were of Asian ethnic group, including over 100 patients in India who participated in the trial. So I think there's a good suggestion that this would work in the South Asian community. So how can we ensure that patients from ethnic minority groups can receive the best treatments? So I think, as many people have said today, we need to understand the population, how they make decisions, how they like to access healthcare. And Arzu gave us some really interesting perspectives on the different ways that people make decisions. And these are not the things they tell me when I see them in the clinic. So that was incredibly interesting about all the people that are involved in the background. But people like me need to understand that a lot more. And using that information, this is where the real challenge comes, is how we redesign the local services with that community in mind, knowing how people like to engage and how they don't like to engage, and all the various different important actors, as Arzu said, in this decision-making process. So how can we take early detection to the patient, to those communities, perhaps in a non-clinic setting? The health walk, what a brilliant idea. But if you tap that on with some, early detection of other things in a non-threatening way, I think we could do a lot of good there. And some simple health education messages during those health walks. Khalid has set up a walking cricket group, so for people who can't run, walking cricket, bowls, there are all sorts of things he's been involved with in the past, just to get people out of the house, doing a bit of exercise, talking about things, having a bit of informal peer support. And then we need to be able to provide local specialist treatment. So at Salford, we've taken our renal clinics out to the communities. So nearly any type of specialist renal clinic now happens either at Oldham or in Rochdale, in Bolton, Wigan, or obviously if you live in Salford, you can go to Salford. So there's much less barrier in terms of travelling, time off work, and that's been hugely successful. But still, you've got to pluck up the courage to walk into that clinic, and if that's your main barrier, we haven't really tackled that one. So we run a free evening event in March 2019 to mark World Kidney Day. This was organised by Khalid and his community, as he's very well known, and it was held at the Tweedale Community Centre in Rochdale, that some of you may recognise from that photo. So we had a panel of speakers, mainly South Asian and Urdu speaking, and many of the talks were given in those languages. A diabetologist, a dietitian, a nephrologist, and some transplant surgeons, including some role-playing in Urdu. I couldn't understand a word, but you could hear a pin drop in the room, and it was talking about very simple healthcare messages and life experiences. There was a break for prayers in the mosque, which was just in the neighbouring building. Delicious Asian dinner, very similar to the lunch we've enjoyed, and then some informal discussion around the table with the various health professionals, colleagues of mine who attended. So it was hugely successful. The room was packed out. We had over 300 people coming, and we were all amazed. So these were not really kidney patients. They were people just from the local community who wanted to hear more. But, you know, what have we done since then? We've talked about it, but we haven't managed to really replicate that, and it's because of the challenges of sustainability. So what we learned was patients and carers were absolutely vital. We couldn't have done it without Khalid and his family and friends to really spread the message and get those 300 people to come. We found a format that worked in that community. It might not work in Bolton, so we'd have to find people in Bolton, you know, who would advise us on what works for them. We need more patients and volunteers to make it sustainable. We found how the community was very much influenced by individual stories, informal discussions, not being told what to do by people like me. We found that the NHS staff were very generous in giving their time, but the funding is difficult. That was funded by our local kidney charities, but we can't keep asking the same people for money to hold those events in many different places. So I think it's really a challenge with commissioning if we really want to change healthcare for our local community. So the question is, where can we go from here to make the most impact? So I think collaboration is the way forward, but also encouraging patients and their families. You will all know of brilliant patients or family members, carers who would be very keen to get involved, but I think we don't capitalise on that, or people don't realise that we want them. We need them. We need to talk to commissioners and to politicians. We need to challenge the politicians in the town. You know, we've got this huge problem in Greater Manchester. We've got some idea how to solve it, but it does take a little bit of reorganisation and some money, unfortunately. And there's the challenge of how we pay for that. So in summary, we know that South Asian people are 3 to 5 times more likely to need dialysis. And we know, sadly, the prognosis and quality of life on dialysis is poor. We know that we should be aiming for pre-emptive living donor kidney transplant for as many patients as possible with CKD stage 5. But we know that probably that's not going to be the reality for everybody. So I've deliberately not dwelt on deceased donation because other people have already done that much better than me. But we do have this huge challenge of how to make this work in 2020 in our country to maintain and build on trust in the public. And I have a feeling, I don't have proof, but I have a feeling that South Asian patients are missing out on the best treatments for early CKD in a lot of circumstances. And I think there's a real opportunity to improve on that. But I think if we work together, we can improve people's health and their life chances by collaborating together. Thank you for listening.